But that's okay because you kids are here. Let's go to the first topic of discussion, which is kind of the cultural history of the 1920s. Now, you wrote a paper on that, and you will get that paper returned to you. In fact, if you check on your Skyward, your grade on that paper has been inputted into Skyward.
Did they get better after you started reading?
Yes, I mean, there were some better papers. And the notion of that paper kind of connects to what we want to talk about. First, that during the 1920s, there was a cultural conflict between those who clung to kind of what they saw as traditional America, small town values, traditional America, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, values that they clung to, and those who embraced what might be considered more modern values. Now, in terms of sources of this conflict, one of the sources of the conflict was immigration. A large number of people coming between 1900 and World War I to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe, and that caused people to be fearful that they were losing, a sense of American culture and American ideology, particularly because many of these people were Catholics. The great migration of African Americans out of the South and into northern cities also startled some traditional thinkers, right? New ideas, like particularly involving religion, like evolution, new behaviors that revolved around the automobile, more mobility, the ability to have more isolation. And that results in, kind of the emergence of the flapper, the modern woman, who seemed to be questioning traditional gender roles. And all of these things sort of coalesce into a conflict between those that wanted to keep things the way they were and those who were more comfortable with change. Now, some of the manifestations, and the greatest kind of manifestation, and several of you have made this point in your paper, the greatest manifestation of that conflict was the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, right? So there is a question on the test about the Ku Klux Klan. We didn't talk about it in class, but many of you wrote about it in your papers. And what, I don't know how much of the backstory is there, but we have a familiarity with the Ku Klux Klan. We know that in the 1870s, right? In the 1870s, in the early 1870s, the Ku Klux Klan emerged in the southern part of the United States, the ex-Confederate states, and the Klan was a vigilante organization that was intended on overthrowing what those people who joined the Klan and supported it believed was radical rule, right? We had talked about radical Reconstruction in the South. We talked about how the Republicans, in the aftermath of Johnson and Lincoln's presidential Reconstruction, determined that didn't lean far enough towards justice, and they passed the first, second, and third Reconstruction Acts that basically threw out all of the Reconstruction in the South and replaced those southern state governments with state governments that were made up of a coalition of scallywags, carpetbaggers, and freed blacks. And they implemented Republican governments, and the white South reacted to this by saying, no, we want to overthrow that. And the Ku Klux Klan was the way that they attempted to do that, by violence, by intimidation, by destruction of property. What we didn't say is when the Klan was successful, and they were, and when the white South was successful in overthrowing those Republican governments, the Klan went away. Right? So the Ku Klux Klan that we talked about as being so influential in the reconstructed South and during radical Reconstruction kind of fades away. It was mission accomplished. And then in 1915, it is going to reemerge, right? And the Ku Klux Klan that reemerges and rises to power in the 1920s is a Klan that has a broader set of targets. It is a Klan that is responding to what they see as fundamental changes in society that are threatening the institutions that they hold dear. So their targets are no longer confined to those that supported radical Reconstruction and African Americans. Now their targets were Catholics. Now their targets were radicals. Now their targets were immigrants. Now their targets were also African Americans, but other liberals and people that they considered to be radicals as well were part of the flapper, the kind of emergence of this modern society that they were backlashing against, right? And so the Klan represents the greatest manifestation in some ways of old America responding to what they saw as being changes. Now, another area where that conflict, and I should say in your papers, few of you handled this well, and that was prohibition, right? Prohibition. Prohibition and the battle over prohibition was also something that reflected a cultural divide. However, in terms of prohibition, the dries represented old America. This was something that was confusing to some of you. You said, well, oh, you know, the wets were old America because they supported, Annie, what are you doing? Why are you sneaking over there? Why aren't you participating?
My dear friend Olivia.
Why aren't you participating in our review session?
Track practice.
Oh, I see.
About this.
Oh, I see. Does he know you're here now?
I don't think he does.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, anyways, we were talking about that, and we said that, look, yes, dry America, Prohibition America, even though Prohibition was championed by progressives, right, represented old America because consumption of alcohol, the saloon, wine, whiskey, was associated with Catholicism and immigrants, the city, and change. And so dry America that wanted to keep small-town rural values thought that one way to preserve those values was to ban alcohol, right? So wet America was urban, was immigrant, right, and tended to embrace changes. So it was a little confusing, and some of you don't handle it particularly well in your papers. But one thing that was mentioned in your textbook, the Prohibition Amendment that was passed in the 18th Amendment was passed in I think 1919, was enforced by something called the Volstead Act, right? The Volstead Act was passed to enforce prohibition, and it starts January 1, 1920. I should mention that really the Volstead Act made the distribution, sale, and manufacture of alcohol illegal. It never really made the consumption of alcohol illegal. So, in other words, if you transported it, if you distributed it, if you manufactured it, it was against the law. If you happened to have it and consume it, it was not necessarily against the law. So it was targeted at the saloons and the manufacture of alcohol as less the consumers. Now, a third question, or another question on the test, has to do with a book entitled The Man Nobody Knows. And that comes out of the chapter 31. And I've been going into a lot of detail about those questions because we really didn't talk about them in class. The Man Nobody Knows was written by a guy by the name of Bruce Barton. And it was a book that depicted Jesus as the greatest advertising and salesman in world history. Now, what's interesting about that book is, in another time, if you would have made an argument that Jesus took 12 nobodies and made it into the greatest organization that the world had ever known, people might be upset by that and consider it to be sacrilege. But in the 1920s, to call someone a great businessman was the highest of compliments. And so what The Man Nobody Knows kind of indicates is that people were associating kind of business success with actual even religion, right? That it's comparable. Success in business is comparable to religious piety on some level. Now, a part of that prosperity of the 1920s and business success revolved around the automobile. And the automobile we discussed proliferated during this time period. Millions of cars were manufactured. That had a significant impact on prosperity during the period, but it also had a cultural impact. I mean, the initial beginning of the growth of suburbia, is in the 1920s when there are cars, right? Now people can move outside of the cities. Now the true growth of suburbia is going to be really in the 1950s and 1960s, but the initial growth of suburbs is going to be in the 1920s. The car is going to allow people to travel for leisure activities. They're going to give people independence and mobility, right? It's going to be transformative culturally, right? And so it has a big impact on the culture of society. Now, in terms of feminism and the flapper and women, and voting rights, we know that in 1920 was the first election where women were entitled to vote. They were not prohibited. States could no longer prohibit them from voting as a result of the 19th Amendment. Now, but the women's rights movement is going to extend further. And the flapper and women embracing modern ideology is going to be something that the Klan and others reject. But a real disturbing part of that is that women begin to advocate for some sorts of birth control, to take control of their own bodies and whether or not they would become pregnant. And the woman who was central to the advocacy of birth control was a woman by the name of Margaret Sanger, right? So Margaret Sanger is pictured in your book and discussed on the test. Now, after we talked about the cultural history of the 1920s, well, we didn't actually talk about it. You read about it and wrote a paper about it. And there are various topics in your book that we just highlighted out of that chapter. We went on to talk about the politics of the era, and we know this, that in 1920, Warren G. Harding took on James Cox in the presidential election, right? Harding was a Republican, Cox was a Democrat. One of the biggest issues in that election was the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. World War I had ended in November of 1918. Wilson had negotiated with our European allies a treaty that ended that war, the Treaty of Versailles, that included a League of Nations that Wilson wanted the United States to participate in. That treaty was never ratified by the Senate, and America never participated in the League of Nations. And Wilson attempted to make the election of 1920 a great referendum on the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles, and asking the question, does America want to step forward and be the dominant power in the world? Which Wilson argued was our destiny, right? That we would be the dominant power in the world, that American leadership could lead to a new world order in which wars would be eliminated and peace would be established by a powerful League of Nations that included all the great powers in the world. The United States rejects that by electing Harding, who promised the American people a return to normalcy, right? And it kind of embodied where Americans were at that time. That they no longer wanted to embrace crusades and fix things like progressivism had been a part of. They wanted to return to what Harding called normalcy. Now we said this, we said that Harding had quite a few shortcomings. Even though he was a seated senator from Ohio, as William Allen White put it, his mind was vague and fuzzy. But he kind of embraces that and assures the American people that he would surround himself with a cabinet that would be the best since George Washington. And we said in some ways, he does just that. Herbert Hoover is his Secretary of Commerce. Charles Evans Hughes is his Secretary of State. Andrew Mellon is his Secretary of Treasury. but he also surrounds himself with cronies from his hometown in Ohio, the Ohio Gang as they're frequently called, and one of them, the Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, is involved in the most spectacular scandal of the era. Does anyone besides the instructor know what the name of that scandal was? The Teapot Dome scandal. What did it involve? Dear Abigail, do you know what the Teapot Dome scandal involved? Yes.
Didn't it have to do with like selling land in order to make money?
It had to do with naval oil reserves, right? Oil reserves that were on land, leasing those reserves to business interests in return for a bribe. Secretary of Interior Albert Fall was indicted, or was involved in that scandal, and a spectacular scandal that really doesn't taint Harding while he lived, because he died and Coolidge took over before he had served out his first term. Coolidge takes over, and what we associate with Coolidge the most is his reticence, his reluctance to kind of do things, his reluctance to say things. They nicknamed him Silent Cow. But he was a minimalist in a manner where he believed that the least that government could do the best, and that the best thing would be to let things alone, and they typically fix themselves. And one of the things, if left alone, that would be successful was business prosperity, right? And Coolidge is associated with a period of business prosperity, and we made the case in class that the prosperity of the 1920s was very real. That the output expanded, prosperity was real, wages increased, the standard of living of Americans increased, and people attributed that to a Republican ideology that raised tariffs and lowered taxes and deregulated business, that allowed that business prosperity to really kind of trickle down to the masses of people. So the 20s is this extraordinarily prosperous period. Coolidge is central to that period. When he runs for re-election in 1924, he is overwhelming, not really re-election, but election in 1924. He is nominated by the Republican Party. Does anyone know who the Democrats nominated and why the Democratic Convention of 1924 was significant? Go ahead, Tad. You know this. You've got it. Let it rip.
Alice?
No, that was 28. Good guess, though. Yes. John Davis, right? The most average name in America, right? John Davis. And what was significant about the convention that nominated him, dear Abigail? We said that you could argue this convention was a manifestation of the cultural tension. Not too many of you did, right? But you could argue, some of you did, right? I mean, there's only 8 of you in here, but go ahead, Robbie. Did they not, Olivia, vote 102 times before they nominated John Smith in 1924? And the division was between Southern Democrats and urban Democrats. And there was also in that convention a proposal to denounce the Ku Klux Klan by name, which failed by 1 vote. Right? And so it was old versus new in that convention. Southern Democrats old, Northern Democrats new, that emerges in that time, and defeated by only 1 vote, a resolution condemning the Ku Klux Klan. Now, we said that the Coolidge is going to under Coolidge, under Harding, lower taxes, raise tariffs, deregulate, emasculate labor. We talked about the agenda of Republicans in that period, which seems to work. By 1928, the economy is booming. Prosperity is relatively widespread. Certainly there were pockets of poverty. But Herbert Hoover, who is going to be the nominee of the Republican Party in 28, is someone that people have great expectations for. Here was a man that combined small-town values and administrative talents. He was the best of both worlds, right? He had been the Secretary of Commerce in the Harding and Coolidge administration, and now he is overwhelmingly and enthusiastically nominated by the the Republicans in 28 with the hope that he would deliver even more prosperity, and that's what he says. Now, we said that one thing that was true about Hoover, he had never held an elected office, right? He had never held an elected office. He had tremendous administrative experience, but he had very limited political experience, and he was not a warm and ingratiating person. He was somebody that got things done, right? So Herbert Hoover now is the nominee of the Democrats. Tad, you'll never guess who the nominee of the Republicans were. Al Smith. And what was significant, Ava, about Al Smith and his nomination by the Democrats in 28? Let it fly, go ahead.
He was a Roman Catholic.
He was a Catholic, the first Catholic to be nominated by a major party for the presidency. He was, Robbie, the governor of New York, a popular and by all accounts effective governor of New York. But you have a thought you'd like to share.
Herbert Hoover Republican?
He was. Did I say a Democrat?
Yeah.
Oh, I apologize. He was in fact a Republican. You know, if I misstated, and Al Smith was the Democrat, you know, in that election. Now, we know that Hoover was elected to the presidency with great expectations. He combined, you know, experience, you know, administrative experience with small town values. And there was great hope and expectation that he would extend American prosperity even further. But we know in 1929 the stock market crashes, which ushers in the beginning of a Great Depression, and that from 1929 until 1933, the U.S. economy bottoms out. It bottoms out at 25% unemployment. Now, Herbert Hoover's response to that is to do more to attempt to recover the U.S. economy than any previous president had ever done. I mean, up until this point, the notion had been laissez-faire. The economy functions and things happen, and the federal government is relatively small and unable to actually influence economic trends. The best thing for the federal government to do was to balance the budget in order to provide kind of confidence in the economy and let things fix themselves. Let prices fall, let wages fall, let interest rate fall. I mean, Mellon is going to say this, liquidate, liquidate, liquidate. Things will get bad, but they'll recover. Hoover doesn't buy that, and it doesn't seem like it's working, so he intervenes. Yet, we know Hoover as someone who seems to do something but not enough. What was the line that we said that Hoover would not cross in terms of intervention? Go ahead, Joe.
Handouts?
Yes, handouts. He would not directly aid the people with any kind of tangible benefit. Food, money, anything. He would support businesses and banks and insurance companies. And so it appeared to many that Hoover was willing to feed the starving Belgians in World War I. He was willing to give assistance and handouts, if you were, to banks and businesses. But he argued if he handed things to the average person, it would undermine the values that had made America great. And Abigail has a thought about that. Let's see what it is.
Was the thought he would promise a chicken in every pot, or he wouldn't promise a chicken?
Oh, he would, when he was elected.
Okay.
Right? A chicken in every pot, a car in every garage. Right? It was a way of saying that the prosperity of the 1920s would spread, you know, wider, you know. So we said that Hoover, although he works hard, you know, and although he may have been a great president under different conditions, Hoover is maligned by the media. I mean, Hoovervilles, the Hoover pub, Hoover blankets, etc. And then really what damages his reputation and ensures that he would not be reelected was the way that he treated the bonus army. Who were the bonus marchers? Yes.
Was it the veterans from World War I that wanted to get their bonus ahead of time because of the Depression?
Yes. They were veterans of World War I who had been promised a bonus in 1945, and Robbie, they wanted that bonus paid to them in 1932. So given they had nowhere to go and nothing to do because they were unemployed in 25% unemployment in 1932, they decided to march to Washington. They came in large numbers, thousands of them, camped on the Anacostia Flats, and there demanded that Congress accelerate that bonus. Congress does not accelerate the bonus. Hoover does not address them, and eventually many of them go home, but some linger. What is Hoover's last thing to do with the bonus marchers that makes him so darn unpopular? What does he do? Yes?
Did he dispatch an army to get the money?
Yes, he dispatched the army. Now, you'll never guess who was in command of the army that was responsible for dispersing the bonus marchers.
This is a guess.
Go ahead.
Is it Eisenhower?
No, it was not. Eisenhower was part of it. He was not in command. Douglas MacArthur, who was the supreme military commander, who had abandoned the Philippines in World War II, he was the one that was responsible for really kind of exceeding Hoover's orders. And this makes Hoover look really, really bad and opens the way for the election of 32. And we know in 32 that the Democrats nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who by all accounts was a shallow, kind of pampered young man who had everything in life sort of handed to him, who aspired to follow the political trajectory of his famous cousin Theodore, right? And had most recently been the Democratic nominee for vice president in 1920. But then what happened, Ava? In 1921, what happened to Roosevelt that changes his life? Go ahead.
He got polio.
He was stricken by polio. And polio, we said, transformed Roosevelt, created him in an empathy and an understanding for the downtrodden, and probably paved the way for his greatness. So in adversity, that's where we develop character, right? In adversity. And we may have learned that at the NHS induction ceremony, right? And there may actually be even some sort of question on the test about that. Now, we talked about the New Deal, you know, the first and second New Deal. The first New Deal and the second New Deal were committed to relief, recovery, and reform. And we divided the legislation in those areas. Now, there are not going to be questions about all the alphabet soup agencies, but one there will be questions on is the Civilian Conservation Corps. What was that? The Civilian Conservation Corps. Does anyone besides David and myself know what the Civilian Conservation Corps was? Yes.
Is that when the young men would go and the paycheck would be sent home?
Yes. Oh, Jessica, you should know that one. That's when young men ages 18 to 25 could enlist in the Civilian Conservation Corps. They would go to national parks, national memorials, wherever, live in barracks, work, earn $30 a week, 25 of it would be sent home to their families, right? This would take the most dangerous people off the streets because these people were unable to get jobs. It was enormously popular and was only curtailed during World War II, right? When you needed these people, it was quickly taken away. Another piece of legislation that you might need to be familiar with is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. Does anyone besides Anthony and myself know what the objective was of the Agricultural Adjustment Act? Go ahead, Anthony.
It basically paid the farmers to not grow stuff on their land.
Yes, Anthony, you are quite correct. In a bizarre manner, farmers were paid not to produce crops. Why? What did they want to do? Yes.
Lower prices?
They wanted to raise prices, right?
Oh, yeah.
Raise prices by lowering production, right? So they wanted to lower production. Higher prices were a result of farm surpluses. How do we get rid of these surpluses? We pay farmers not to produce with the Agricultural Adjustment Agency. Oh, by the way, what did the Glass-Steagall Act do? Does anybody remember? It was a piece of legislation passed in the first New Deal, right, that was intended to reform the banking system by creating what? It creates a government corporation which is still in existence to this day. Does anybody remember what? Go ahead, dear Jillian.
Federal Depository Insurance.
The Federal Depository Insurance Corporation was created by Glass-Steagall, virtually eliminates runs on the bank. Now, there will be a question about the National Recovery Administration on the test. The National Recovery Administration, the NRA. We didn't talk about that all in class, and you should maybe take a look at that. Now, we said that the first New Deal was what Roosevelt promised, and that was bold experimentation and action. A whirlwind of legislation, 16 pieces of legislation, 100 days that attempted to exact relief, recovery, and reform. And that for the most part, people were happy with the first New Deal. The impact that it made on people was important and significant, and things improved under the first New Deal. And we said in the congressional elections of 1934 that the Democrats actually won seats in Congress, right, which is unusual. But by 1935 and late 34, there was opposition to the New Deal. And we listed 3 people who were opponents to the New Deal, who were challengers to the New Deal, that challenged the New Deal from the left. And you should be familiar with all 3, right? One was Francis Townsend. Francis Townsend. What was his area of challenge? What did he see? Go ahead, Ava.
That everybody over 60 should retire.
Yes, the way that the elderly were treated in the economy, and that income should be redistributed from the people that are working to the elderly in something called the Townsend Plan. Charles Coughlin.
Radio priest.
The radio priest, who really is going to challenge a lot of things, but he's going to argue this conspiracy of Jews was responsible for all the problems that were happening in society, big bankers and industrialists in a conspiracy against the common man, and he really is going to focus on banking and monetary policy. Huey Long is going to be the one where the most questions are. What was the name of his program? Does anybody remember? Long was a governor of Louisiana. Go ahead, Jillian. Share our wealth. And Long proposed a pretty significant redistribution of wealth, right? Where fortunes over a certain amount would be confiscated and redistributed to the people, guaranteeing an income of $5,000 a year, $2,400 a year, a homestead, a car, etc. He challenged the distribution of income and wealth in society and said that democracy and Republican government could never exist as long as that was true. Now, we said in response to that, you have the second New Deal. And the second New Deal included things like the Social Security Act of 35, the so-called rich tax of 35, and the Wagner Act. Oh, do you remember the other day when I asked the kids about the Wagner Act and the kids didn't know? Now, what did we say the other day when we were talking about the Wagner Act? What did the Wagner Act do? Do you remember anything about the Wagner Act, or better known as the National Labor Relations Act? Go ahead, Ted.
Formally recognize a union.
Yes, that under the Wagner Act, the national government would ensure that businesses had to formally recognize and acknowledge the existence of unions and to negotiate with them in good faith, right? Which gave unions the legal right to exist. And with that legal right to exist and the sanction of the national government, the union movement is going to expand in the 1930s. And those union supporters, those people that join those unions together, are going to become a big component of the coalition in the New Deal. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about in class was that as the union movement grew with the Wagner Act, as the basis of that there was a division between the AFL that wanted to concentrate on skilled workers and the CIO, which was actually at one time a faction of the AFL, that wanted to organize unskilled workers, and they competed with each other throughout the Depression and World War II. And then even after the war, the CIO and the AFL competed with each other. But they will unify in response to what? We mentioned this the other day. We mentioned this the other day. We said this is what unified the AFL and CIO in 1947. Well, after 1947, this piece of legislation, we mentioned it yesterday, was a backlash against the Wagner Act. Olivia, do you know the name of the piece of legislation? Do you think your ex-friend Jessica will know the name of the legislation? Do you think David Zimmerman, yes? The Taft-Hartley Act, yes. Okay. Now, we know in 36, with the first and second New Deal, that Roosevelt is overwhelmingly reelected. He almost runs the table, right? He almost wins. He wins 46 of 48 states. The Democrats swell their majorities in Congress to well over 2/3. It looked like that Roosevelt firmly running on the New Deal against, who did he run to? Wendell Willkie in 36, that the people wanted. What was the obstacle that Roosevelt believed that the New Deal was encountering on finally and fully conquering the Great Depression? The Supreme Court, which had 6 conservative justices and 4 ultra-conservative justices that seemed intent on blocking New Deal legislation because they had blocked 7 of 9 pieces of New Deal legislation and declared them unconstitutional. What was Roosevelt's strategy for circumventing the court? Go ahead, Anthony.
The court packing bill.
The court packing bill, which would have allowed Roosevelt to appoint 6 additional justices to the Supreme Court, packing it with 15 and a progressive majority. Did, Olivia, the court packing bill ever pass? It did not. It failed, and with the failure of the court packing bill, it became so that Roosevelt lost his political influence in 37. But by the time we had discussed the court packing bill, we had made mention that things were happening in the rest of the world. We knew that by 1937, Mussolini had invaded what country? Ethiopia, right? And by 37, there had already been a Spanish Civil War in which a fascist, backed by Hitler and Mussolini, attempted to topple the Spanish government and was successful in doing so. What was the name of the fascist that Hitler and Mussolini supported?
Was it Frank?
Francisco Franco.
He was on Jeopardy the other day.
About Francisco Franco. Oh yeah, right, yes sir. And they say history is not important, right? They say it's not data-tested area, right? We have keystone examinations in biology, English, and math. History is not a tested area. Remember, over in North Korea, they can do math. They can't govern themselves. All right, now, so, okay. America's response to aggressive actions by have-not countries, disappointed with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, was to retreat more deeply into isolation, right? To isolation and isolationism. Now, the isolationistic sentiment that was emerging in the 1920s, because look, you know, we said that Harding said he promised he'd return the country to normalcy. Well, what was a part of normalcy? Well, what was a part of normalcy was being isolated from the rest of the world, right? You know, and Americans, you know, based on George Washington's farewell address and the Monroe Doctrine, right, kind of suggested that, look, we're going to stay out of European affairs. The Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence, and we are going to, you know, in the 20s, we're going to raise tariffs, or restrict immigration, demand payments of debt, and kind of retreat into our historic isolationism. And so when these aggressive acts occur, the United States responds by sinking deeper into it. And the manifestation of that is the neutrality acts that are passed between 1935 and 1937 that make actions that could be construed as being a neutral illegal. Right? Now, this is going to open the door for when Mussolini invades Ethiopia, you know, our response is to pass the neutrality. When Franco attempts to topple the Spanish government, we extend the neutrality acts even further. When Hitler goes into the Sudetenland right? Then, we still cling to those neutrality acts. And we said that the British and the French, knowing that America is going to remain neutral, don't have as great of an incentive to stand up to Hitler. Now, we said that Roosevelt is going to try to edge the American people into kind of taking some action against aggression. And he does that with the Quarantine speech in July of 37. In July of 37, Roosevelt delivers the Quarantine speech. And in that speech, he suggests some kind of quarantine, which might be construed as an embargo or something of that nature. What was the response to the Quarantine speech in 37? Go ahead, Ava. Not good. Isolationists are going to respond harshly and demand and Roosevelt backs down and suggests that he really wasn't going to do anything. And now it is fundamentally confirmed that the United States is going to sit this out, right? And let what happens in Europe happen. Now, when Hitler marches or absorbs the Sudetenland, the British declare that we've obtained peace in our time. When he takes the rest of Czechoslovakia, they say, uh-oh, now we're in trouble. When he signs a non-aggression pact with the Russians, now they say, really, uh-oh, we're in trouble. And they pledge themselves to support the Poles if attacked, and the Poles are attacked on September 1, 1939, beginning World War II in Europe. Now, World War II in Asia had already occurred. World War II in Asia is fighting in China, and that already occurred. But World War II in Europe starts December 1, 1939, when Hitler invades Poland. Hitler overwhelms Poland fairly quickly, and then there is a period of time that we refer to as the phony war. Remember, we had a timeline on the board, and how engaged the students were in looking at the timeline on the board as we described these events in World War II. And we said that, well, look, Hitler, the phony war is between, September of 39 and then April of 40, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Hitler rolls through, Belgium and into France and takes Paris by June. That the British and whatever French troops could muster are going to evacuate at Dunkirk, and then England stands against the Nazis alone, right? Appealing to the United States for support in the Battle of Britain. Ava has a thought about the Battle of Britain, Winston Churchill, and Britain's courageous stand against the Germans. What is that thought?
There was something before.
What's that?
There was something before.
What before that?
Did they ever find out why Hitler wasn't doing anything between that time?
I think that he was, just not going to move in winter, and in September, would he be able to pull that off in time? And so he fundamentally waited till the spring, to launch that offensive. And there may be another reason, I don't know. Robbie is a student of World War II and very knowledgeable about a lot of things. Go ahead.
How long did it take for it to fall?
7 weeks. I knew that. I knew that one, 7 weeks. Right?
That's the IDP education.
Yeah.
You gotta pay to get in there. That's where that whole scandal. You don't have to pay to get in Slippery
Good thing
Rock.
Dr. Phil didn't make fun of IDP.
No, we didn't make fun of IUP. You gotta probably pay $10K. Get those SAT scores. You would be a real sucker if they convince you, well, let's see, it's gonna cost you $50,000 to get IUP. You bought that, right? You're in real trouble. So, okay. Britain stands alone. That's a dramatic thing. The first step in aiding Britain is the destroyers bases deal. We give the British destroyers. What do they give us?
Nothing.
Bases.
Oh.
Naval bases in no. It's
No, I thought it was like we lended them.
no, not yet. Destroyers bases deal, right? Okay. Now, after the destroyers bases deal, Roosevelt is reelected for a third term, a big deal. Right? He's reelected for a third term in 1940 against Wilkie. Who was 36 then? Oh, that was what's his name? Alf Landon in 36.
Oh, yeah.
Wilkie in Alf Landon was in 36. Wilkie was in 40, and then Dewey was in 44, and Hoover was in 32. Right now, after he's elected, that's when Lend-Lease is passed. And Lend-Lease is that legislation where we're going to lend or lease the arsenal that England needs to fight against the Germans. Right? Now, when we make the decision, Congress agrees to Lend-Lease at Roosevelt's urging, right? Then we said that we are in essence an ally of the British. And when Russia enters the war, when Germany attacks Russia in June of 41, we extend Lend-Lease to the Russians, right? Now, so we are on the path to war when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. What is the issue that prompts the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor? This is a great moment right here.
They think they have to stay in Japan or fight America. So they think the better way out is to fight America.
Yes, so they want to stay in China. That's the homeland, right? They want to stay in China and overtake China. And the United States insists that they get out. And so they know if they don't get out, they're going to have to go somewhere else and get the resources that have now been embargoed by the United States. And so they know that that's going to bring them into conflict with the U.S., so they attack first at Pearl Harbor. When they attack first at Pearl Harbor, it's going to bring the United States into war. We declare war on Japan, and Hitler declares war on us, and now we're in war. The biggest strategic decision of the initial phase of the war is to go after Germany first, right? So we say, okay, we're in the war. How are we going to approach this? Our approach is going to be Germany first and then Japan, right? And so Germany first is what we do. Now, once the war is declared, there are a lot of domestic things that occur. We didn't talk about pretty much any of them except for mobilization. You know, we said the mobilization of American industry for wartime production is a spectacular success. The demobilization we talked about yesterday, but the mobilization is a spectacular success. But you might want to read about the treatment of Japanese Americans during the war in terms of internment. You might want to take a peek at that. Now, the big controversies of the war, really, in Europe, is opening a second front. When and how would the United States take the pressure off the Russians by opening a second front with an invasion of France? When Churchill and Roosevelt meet at Casablanca in January of 43, do they decide to open a second front in France in 43, yes or no? No. Where do they decide to invade? Robbie, you World War II expert, you.
And Normandy.
Not yet. Not in yes.
Tehran.
Where?
Tehran.
Not in Tehran.
Wait, what? I don't know.
No.
Yeah, what's the question?
The question is, we're in Casablanca.
Okay.
All right? And we are January of 43. And in January of 43, they agree we're not going to open a second front in 43. We're going to open a second front somewhere else,
You want
yes.
to go up through Sicily.
Italy, right? They're going to invade in Italy, right? In
The soft
43.
underbelly.
That's right. The soft underbelly, Churchill said, of Europe. And then they meet with Stalin in Tehran in late 43. Then what do they decide to do? Open a second front, right, in France, and this results in the Normandy invasion on D-Day, right? And we talked about, oh boy, that was a big day. But I wasn't feeling very good on that day. So I kind of ruined it, you know, that I didn't have my full energy to enthusiastically embrace the D-Day invasion.
Maybe you should reteach the law.
I should come back to it, right, in the summer, in July. And there'd only be one person, right? You know, so, okay. From the D-Day invasion, you know, it's the beginning of the end for the Germans. You know, the Americans and the British and the Canadians and the other allies attack from the west to the east, and the Russians come from the east to the west, and they converge upon Germany, eventually defeating them in what becomes known as VE Day, May 7th, 1945. In the meantime, right, you have Japan. Now, we had Roosevelt and Churchill on their way to Tehran met with Chiang Kai-shek in Cairo and promised to extract from the Japanese unconditional surrender. And the point that I wanted to make to you was that promise was like a really big deal because the Japanese didn't like to surrender. I mean, they thought that was less than honorable, and this was going to be a big deal. We said that the result was that the United States would have to, and they were the primary power in the Pacific, they would have to extract the Japanese from all of the possessions that they held, island by island. In the wake of the Battle of Midway, which is the turning point in the Japanese War, when America defeats a significant Japanese fleet and then has the wherewithal then to attack those islands, we start the process of island hopping, liberating island after island. After the islands are liberated, the closer we get to Japan, the harder the Japanese fight in order to get America to back down and accept some kind of negotiating truce. We talked about Iwo Jima. My health was coming back then, right? And we were able to dramatically discuss the events at Iwo Jima, right? And we talked about Okinawa, and eventually the decision to detonate a nuclear weapon on the 6th and on the 10th. Now, prior to that decision, we said that Stalin, Churchill, Attlee, right, /Attlee, and Truman now, because Roosevelt had died on, I think, April 12, 1945, we're going to meet at Potsdam. So this gives us 3 conferences that you might see mentioned on the test. Casablanca, that's in January of 43. Tehran, that's in December of 43. And Potsdam, that's in July of 45. Okay? So Casablanca, January of 43. Tehran, December of 43, and Potsdam in 45. At Casablanca, they invade Italy and demand unconditional surrender. At Tehran, they agree to invade in France, right? And the Russians agree to enter the war against the Japanese. In Potsdam, Russia gives a firm date in when they're going to enter the war against the Japanese. And the United States issues the warning concerning our nuclear weapons to the Japanese and informed the Russians of it.
What was Potsdam again?
Potsdam was July.
Oh no, when did they agree?
At Potsdam, they issued the warning to the Japanese, and they informed the Russians that they have the nuclear weapon. Now, with the nuclear weapons, we said the war ends. And with the war over, the question becomes now the transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. The biggest and most important action the government has that facilitates that transition is the GI Bill. And there will be a question or so about the GI Bill. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, as it's called, the GI Bill, which allocated billions of dollars for education for returning veterans, among other things. But the education kind of really did a lot of different, things, because now these people were college educated, better, more efficient workers, and that allowed them to more slowly transition into the economy. When they did so, they were more efficient. It leads to greater productivity. It's just a very far-reaching and important piece of legislation, right? That notwithstanding, there is still a period of uncertainty, but eventually it leads to this boom that we discussed in length today, right? This wartime boom. We gave a list of reasons for that boom, and we talked about the connection between that boom and the growth of suburbia and the baby boom. Now, The other thing that will be on the test we'll talk about over the next 2 days, and that will be the Cold War. Right, but for there, whoa, this went a little longer than usual. We are done with the questions up until the Cold War. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? Okay, Jillian, can you turn it off?